This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and today I am talking to Garett Jones, who is an associate professor at George Mason University in economics, and also the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center. So, Garett, is there anything else you would like to tell the listener about you?
Well, just a long time ago, I was a Mormon missionary. That had a big influence on my life because it meant at a young age I was making high stakes decisions about what I really believed, and that I think that shaped me ever since.
A listener might find this interesting. I actually read your story about leaving Mormonism before and Garett and I have known each other for, I think it's like 15 years now. We're old, you know. I think we met in IRL, you know, as they say, in 2007, I believe, in DC.
Yeah, I think it was in Huntington Beach the first time, I thought.
No, Huntington Beach was later. I met you first in
later?
2007. Okay. Yeah, Huntington Beach was later. Huntington Beach was a couple years later. So Garrett's family's from SoCal, and you know I have some. Anyway, but I actually met Garett, and I knew some of his academic work, and then I thought about it, and I was like, oh, but I'd read him earlier on these, confessional how I left Mormonism, and this was a thing. Before social media and all that stuff, people would go on Usenet or onto these bulletin boards and these message boards, and they would write their story. Today, if there's an 18 or a 20-year-old Garett Jones leaving the LDS Church, they would probably tweet it out, and it would be like a 100 tweet thread, right?
Yep. But back then, in the early days of the internet, an engineer who left the LDS Church in midlife, I think, he started a very early webpage in 1995, and a couple months after he started his page, I sent him my story of quitting, and my story was that I was less bitter, less angry than a lot of these folks, and I just thought it through more intellectually. And part of the reason I did that is because I had great church leaders who were really supportive. And so I didn't have these sort of hostile experiences that seem to be part of people's leaving religion stories. I had great people, people who I still consider role models. And I just decided, just because you're great people doesn't mean that the golden plates thing really happened.
Yeah, if people want to, I'll probably put it in the link in the show notes. But if you just Google, he now refers to himself as a post-Mormon. I think that
That'll
post
come up. Yep.
that post will come up, and it has a very 1997 HTML, like primitive HTML, like 1.0 look to it.
Yes.
It's got that feel. But we're not here to talk about the Heavenly Father or the Latter-day Saints Church. We are here to talk about your most recent book and the Culture Transplant, which is kind of ominous sounding title, but Culture Transplant: How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones That They Left. So can you just give the listener top line like summary of your thesis, what you found?
Yeah, basically, there's a sort of unwritten, unspoken understanding that in the rich countries, when migrants come here from very diverse countries, that eventually, after one or two generations, migrants are pretty much like the average person in the country. That basically, the melting pot theory is more or less true, except for ethnic food. So, and I knew of a lot of academic research that suggested that this just wasn't true at all. And it was well done by the standards of economists. The most obvious versions of this, of course, are the horrifying invasions of Western Europeans moving to North America, right? I mean, when Western Europeans moved to and invaded in important ways North America, they they did not assimilate to the cultural norms, to the economic practices of Native Americans. And that's like an obvious example. But the question for us is whether migrants today are in some kind of different situation. Do migrants have a different effect on economies than than the migrants from Western Europe had on North America? So fortunately, there's been a whole wave of academic research testing this. More or less short run research where we compare the views of Italian Americans to Italians in Italy, Mexican Americans to Mexicans in Mexico, German Americans to Germans in the US. And we find that even after 2 or 3 generations, people in the US who say, oh, yeah, my ancestors are mostly from Germany, they hold views that are statistically similar to people in Germany today on issues like frugality, on issues like the role of government over the economy, and importantly, the question of trust. So there was persistence rather than perfect assimilation. And so that's just what got me thinking about this. I realized that there was academic research that really hadn't gotten out into the real world, that academics kept locked up in our textbooks, and particularly in our journals, not even our undergrad textbooks. And I thought it was time to write a book that would get this knowledge out there, out into in language that people could understand, and where they could see, oh, this is totally mainstream research. Migrants really do change the countries they move to, and they make them, on average, a lot like the places they came from.
All right. So how just in this cultural environment, I mean, like, how have people reacted to this book? It's out. I'm sure you've gotten some reviews, some feedback from colleagues. Sanguine, outraged, mixed.
Well, so far, I think it's at least from academics, my response has been similar to what I had with my first 2 books. Where what I kind of do is in my first 2 books is I sort of took messages from academic journals and explained them to the masses. And my first book was about IQ, and it's how it matters more for groups than for individuals. My second was about how oligarchy is a little bit underrated. And this third one, so far, like when I ask mainstream scholars in the field to like review my book, they say that I'm doing a good job representing the academic research. I'm just going to I was lucky to have Arindam Chanda, who's a leader in this area of research, read my book and blurb it. And he says, my book is a masterclass in distilling rigorous research and presenting it in a breezy fashion. So I'm doing a fair job carrying academic research and making it sound easier than it should sound to understand, I think. So
Yeah, I will say I've read a lot of this book. I just you sent me a PDF, so whatever. I read on the PDF, and I got big screens, so I can do that, right? But
yeah.
it's breezy. I know your writing style, and yes, you are not you're not a turgid writer, Garrett. You try to engage people. So the trust thing is very interesting to me, and you have a chart in the book. Yeah, so it's, what is this on page? I don't know. It's very early on. Okay, it's in the
Yeah,
early
totally.
page 15. The migration of trust, average trust levels in the home region predict the average trust levels of Americans who came, from that area. And so you see the top right, high trust in the country they're from, and relatively high trust in the United States on the y-axis. Um, and then on the x-axis is the trust where they're from. But so I mean, what's the correlation there, though? I don't see a correlation.
Yeah, so I leave the statistics by and large out of the text itself, right? I know that turns off most readers when you include a lot of technical stuff. That correlation is zero point 0.4, I believe, and so that's to me noticeable, but again, not the whole story. And but I'm particularly interested in the fact that it's really obviously positive, and when multiple people using multiple data sets, checking multiple countries, this isn't just true for the U.S. They always find the direction is in about the same sign. And this is true when we're looking at second, third, fourth generation immigrants. So people who say that their great grandparents came from Sweden, they're statistically distinguishable from people whose great grandparents came from, say, Spain or Italy.
Yeah.
So this is what's noticeable, right? And the effects are economically or quantitatively important. And it's about as close as you're going to get to something like a natural experiment, a real experiment, I guess. Migration
Yeah.
is, of course, a very personal choice, and so it's not random assignment. But you might expect that all the selection forces would tend to weaken this result, right? Like if the best people in the world really do come to America, and on average, it's very likely to be like America's a tough place to get into. So,
Hmm.
so the fact that it's showing up when in a highly selective migration process, which the U.S. has, means that it's even more likely to be true. It'd be even stronger if we had truly random immigration, something like open borders.
Yeah, I mean, although I do have to say, the range on the x-axis, so percentage of people in the region who think other people can mostly be trusted, goes from 0 to
Yep.
80, whereas on the y-axis for America, it goes from 0 to 60. It looks like there's some compression in the U.S., so that's where the point four. I mean, so point four correlation. It's modest. It's not small. It's not large. So that's where that's coming from, right?
Well, notice that doesn't actually have to be true at all. There's nothing about that particular part of the relationship that pushes down the correlation. So you can have a perfect relationship on a perfect slope line and still have something where, with the slope being 1/2x, right? Like you can have a relationship that's y equals 1/2x, and so the relationship is half as strong in magnitude terms, and just have a lot of dispersion around that. So there's quite a difference between thinking in terms of correlation, which is closely related to r squared, right,
Mm-hmm.
versus the magnitude of the sign. And this is something that macroeconomists have to sweat over a lot, right? It's not just that correlation isn't causation; it's that a high correlation doesn't mean a big effect size.
That's
Um,
fair.
and so I try to find a few ways to discuss this in a way that's intelligible to my readers. But I think the most important one for us here is what I call the spaghetti theory of cultural change, which is that you're right. The y-axis range is narrower, and I personally think that a large part of that is because when people come to America, we Americans we all shape each other, and so we all meet in the middle. So if you did a statistical analysis of the food of the dining practices of Americans today, you'd say, well, Americans eat a lot of spaghetti, and Italian Americans eat a lot of spaghetti. So it looks like Italian Americans and other Americans must have the Italians must have assimilated to the American norm of eating spaghetti. But of course, that's not what happened, right? Like Italians come here, they share the spaghetti with us, and then we become more like them. So part of the reason why I think the immigrants from low trust countries are more trustworthy once they're in America after a couple of generations is because they're shaped by the culture around them.
Mm-hmm.
But that acculturation is a two-way street.
Mm.
So and we should always keep that in mind.
I see what you're saying. So
We're meeting in the middle, and that meeting in the middle is consistent with, on average, in the for the range of variation we've had in the past, it's consistent with, say, Mexican Americans, Italian Americans becoming more trustworthy than you would expect just based on their home country estimates. They're around a lot of people who are really trusting, so why not be trusting yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I just like it's not really a technical question. So this effect that you're talking about in the data, did you see are the effects kind of linear where, let's say you have a host country and 10% are migrants from country X, is the effect a fifth what it would be if it was 50%, or is there nonlinear effects where you have a low enough percentage and then their pairwise interactions with their non-migrant host country individuals increases enough that it starts dampening it out. I guess what I'm saying is, like, is there
This is a great
any
question. Yeah.
critical threshold? Is there a critical mass where migrant communities can persist and maintain their values, whereas below that mass they tend to get emulsified?
This is a great question, and it's one that I wish other people did more work on. Um, I can point to little pieces of the puzzle, but the most um, well known of which is related to Putnam's work on local trust, where basically people tend to be less trusting when they're in highly diverse neighborhoods, for instance. Um, so there's some kind of element of being in a highly ethnically diverse neighborhood that sort of breaks down these sort of um, trust channels in local neighborhoods. But I'm really trying to stick to the broad. When I look in the data, I can tell you that you see linear relationships. And when I look at scatter plots, I'm always on the lookout for something that's obviously a Goldilocks story where there's some kind of upside down U relationship. And we really see these fairly linear relationships in transmission. I'm curious about this question. There is this question underlying what you suggested here, which is, if a group gets large enough, do they sort of just eventually just become their own group and not assimilate at all, right? Do you get the equivalent of like Quebec, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious about this, and it's these are the sort of agglomeration relationships that are beyond my testing ability. And to me, what's noteworthy is that, like, once you start thinking about the fact that culture does persist, then it opens the door to these later questions. But I do have a feeling that a lot of them are just going to end up being empirical models. So I guess I follow the macroeconomist approach of, when in doubt, assume things are linear, and remember that the quest for nonlinear relationships will mostly lead you down rabbit holes and puzzles rather than clear answers.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That's great. So, so I think, you have a chapter in there called the assimilation myth, and I think you've kind of, just in the précis of your book, you kind of talked about what it is. But could you elaborate a little bit about it, because we do, and just for the non-American listeners out there, the whole idea is, people come to America and they shed their old, language, values, and, they become American, and, they're not distinguishable, generations later. Their descendants are not from the people that were here a century or 2 centuries earlier. And a lot of this is in the context, actually, of the Great Migration around the turn of the 20th century, when a lot of immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern European Jews and Eastern Europeans also arrived. And they were culturally very different from the Anglo founding stock and the Irish and the Germans who had arrived, in the middle of the 19th century. And so the idea here is like, well, all these different European groups create a melting pot, and all become Americans. This was obviously reinvented, retrofitted a little bit for post 1965 immigration wave, which is mostly Asian and Latin American. But that's the idea of assimilation, of the melting pot. Now that has been challenged a little bit by actually left wing activists of late, the idea of the salad bowl, multiculturalism. But both of these ideas, I think, presuppose that there's going to be some high level convergence on commonality of values. And can you talk about how you might take some issue with that?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, for instance, on this language question, right? The word language, I just checked my index, only comes up once in the book. It's obvious that after a couple of generations, everybody in the U.S. is going to speak English, right? It's obvious that after a couple of generations in Germany, all the migrants are going to speak German, right? So, like, to a first approximation, it's going to be 100%. So I don't care about language. I don't care about what languages are listed on the ATM when you walk up to it. That's not what my book's about. I'm interested in the traits that, according to economists, are important drivers of economic outcomes and especially political outcomes. And so that's why when I dug into it, I found that in the second, third, fourth generation, home country trust attitudes are transmitted to the new country, maybe 40%. That's the way I add it all up. So 40% of home country trust attitudes are brought over from the home country. So if you have a lot of migrants coming from low trust countries, that's going to, on net, is going to make your country a little less trusting than it would be otherwise. That's been discussed before. I also bring in data that hasn't been discussed outside of the journals on savings rates. Basically, home country frugality seems to be substantially transmitted to migrants in their new country. They import attitudes toward the future and toward savings from the home country. And based drawing a lot on the work of Alberto Alesina in particular, who just passed away, and a group of co-authors who worked with him, I found that attitudes toward the role of government in the economy seem to matter a lot. So Alesina, like a lot of economists of Italian descent, are very interested in these questions of cultural persistence of traits. And It turns out that basically migrants who come from countries that have strong family values tend to really believe in a lot of government regulation. This so-called amoral familism is the term it goes by in the literature. Um, so it turns out that uh, the way you get the way you get a labor market with low degrees of regulation and sort of neoliberal right to hire and right to fire is not by persuading people of the magic of the invisible hand. The way you get that is by having a lot of citizens who think, yeah, I think the boss can be trusted. And so in Northern Europe, where people are more likely to say, yeah, I think the boss can be trusted, you're a little more likely to get those kinds of, ironically, more laissez faire policies. And people from countries that are low trust tend to think, well, I can't trust the boss to decide whether to fire me. He might just be mad at me. And so it turns out that family, basically, the belief in neutral rule of law, the belief in sort of universal norms of behavior, rather than just sticking up for your family at all costs, seems to be a real predictor of de facto market-friendly values. So if you're bringing in folks, so if your country has a lot of immigration of folks from countries that have traditional strong family values where you stick up for your family right or wrong, that's probably going to import strong labor market regulation into your voting booth. That's a finding of Alberto Alesina. So
it
there are
sounds
multiple channels at work here, right? So I got trust, I got savings, I got labor market regulation. Those are sort of my three headline areas of multi-generational attitudes being transmitted to the new country.
well. So when you're talking about trust and family values, that's really interesting because obviously, this has a relationship to Joe Henrich's ideas in The Weirdest People in the World. Where
Exactly. You're totally right.
Yeah, and so I mean, just to reiterate for listeners who do not know about this book and this idea, weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed. It's just an acronym for the sort of individuals that have been the basis of psychology studies for about a century, and that basically means college students, university students in Western countries. And weird people tend to have a certain set of values, de-emphasize family, emphasize rule of law, trusted institutions, and whatnot. And depersonalize basically a lot of the public space. So these societies turn out to be really good for scalable corporations and big institutions. You don't have to have a lot of police if most people are not going to steal from their fellow citizen, even if they don't know them. I do have to mention, you can kind of see the difference. I was in Italy many years ago, and Italy has, I think, like 3 layers of police everywhere: the Carabinieri, or the national police, and there's also
Mhm.
tax police, who makes sure that that the merchants are collecting taxes, and then there's like the regular police. And so there are places that have to be very, very over policed, in part because well, I mean, to be candid, people will not self-govern in the exact same way as they will, to give a stylized example, a small town in Minnesota where you don't need that many police because the neighbors are not out to get each other, right?
Yeah, local trust has really huge payoffs, right? Generalized trust, as it's usually known in literature. So, yeah, so that's the part of that channel has been discussed a lot, and even some people who were in favor of open borders have tried to critique that literature, and I think they failed. But what I do is I, for the first time, bring in the trust and the labor market, the savings rate and the labor market regulation literature, general attitudes toward government, and show that these attitudes too are persistent across generations. So the idea that after 2 generations, the children of migrants assimilate to their new homelands, and so they're statistically indistinguishable from other people in the country, people whose ancestors were there for a long time, totally false. That's why it's a myth. So full assimilation on political and social attitudes within 2 generations is unambiguously a myth, and it deserves to be torn out of our textbooks and torn out of our ideologies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, let's talk about some specific examples. You have a chapter on the Chinese. You talk about the Chinese a fair amount, and
Yeah.
let's just I'm gonna set the stage real quickly for the listener. Most of the listeners are probably American, so you guys might not know that there's a vast, vast diaspora of Chinese, overseas Chinese, mostly from Fujian and Guangdong, in Southeast Asia at various proportions. So Thailand is heavily Sinified. The Thai elite is heavily Chinese, although not exclusively. They're quite mixed, including the royal family. Then you have Indonesia, where you have a large Chinese community, but proportionally it's small. It's a really populous country, and that community tends to be more insulated from the majority because of the religious difference, right? Muslim
Yeah,
versus
yeah,
non-Muslim. And then you have Malaysia, which is not as populous of a country as Thailand. It doesn't have as many Chinese in absolute numbers, but proportionally, they're about
yeah.
like 30 some percent of the population. And so you have all of these different cases, and they're Chinese in Vietnam. A lot of the boat people were Chinese Vietnamese, in Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. So, all these Chinese in Southeast Asia, and, obviously Chinese in the United States and Canada. Also, there are Chinese in Latin America. So, we could just keep going, but I'll let you take it away, Garrett.
Yeah, yeah. And so it turns out that across Southeast Asia, one of the ways that if you're trying to predict how rich a country is, how market friendly it is, turns out you're going to have a tough time doing better than just checking to see the percent Chinese, the percent of people whose ancestors came from China, maybe 2, 3, even more than 4 generations ago. And so, yeah, percent Chinese descent is a pretty strong predictor of prosperity. Of course, in economics and social sciences, you always got to ask is correlation causation. But there's this other literature that's longer, that looks back further than this 2 or 3 generation trust literature I talked about. That's known as the deep roots literature. And my favorite part of that literature looks at basically how the chess pieces were set across the world in the year 1500 before Europeans went everywhere and started taking over things. And if you just look at how technologically advanced civilizations were in different parts of the world in 1500, and then you keep an eye on where those folks went or did not go, it turns out that, for example, across the Western Hemisphere, you can do a pretty good job predicting how rich a country is by just looking at percent of European descent. Adding in Asian migration helps a bit too, of course. But and the question is, of course, is it correlation or causation? And so I have to walk through that quite a bit to sort of help people think, well, what would correlation without causation look like in this case? But in the case of China, it's really clear that the year 1500 was pretty much the peak of the Ming Dynasty. It was a golden age, and as in the Qing Dynasty, as things started falling apart, a lot of people started leaving China and moving across Southeast Asia to other places. And the way I think of it is that those migrants who left China during the decaying decades of the Ming Dynasty were basically carrying the seeds of success of the Ming glory decades to these new national homes and planting seeds that have borne fruit in the 20th and 21st centuries. So, for instance, Malaysia is a country that, as you mentioned, is about 1/3 of Chinese descent. And the Chinese community is pretty much kept out of politics there. Yet, nevertheless, Malaysia has quite strong economic institutions. It doesn't appear that basically having Chinese people in the government is some kind of necessary condition in any way for good institutional quality. I don't want to, I want people to not fall for that line of thinking there. And more generally, across Southeast Asia, percent Chinese is a good predictor of just good institutional quality. And so I think of that as, like I said, planting the seeds of Ming prosperity, of the promise of the Ming Dynasty throughout a much larger part of the world. It's worth remembering in this context that China is the world's poorest majority Chinese country by far in per capita terms, right? Hong Kong, rest in peace. Taiwan, Singapore, all majority Chinese and all far richer in per capita terms. China itself is under the Chinese Communist Party is a laggard, a real laggard. And so that means there's going to be pressure for outmigration from communist China for a long time as people try to move to places. And I think if they're allowed to move to other places in the world, they're very likely to plant the roots of institutional success that can help make the new countries they move to far richer, more prosperous, more market friendly.
I mean, do you think China's modern poverty is due to communism or something else?
I mean, at the 50,000 foot level, just communism. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to me that if I think to a lot of economists that if the other side had won the Civil War, They probably would have gotten on with their market orientation like quite a few decades earlier and probably been more democracy friendly. It's hard to know exactly the counterfactual, but basically, if the KMT had won the Civil War and beaten the communists, we'd be facing a much more prosperous and probably broadly more democratic China today. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think there's anything. One could ask the question: is there something about billion-person countries that makes them incredibly hard to manage? I think
Mm-hmm.
the real answer is we don't know the question to that because we've only got two of them on the planet, and so that's not enough to make any clear conclusions.
Well, as a human, I'm actually like horrified by what communism hath wrought. And now that you're making me think about this, imagining a China as prosperous as Taiwan, and I'm wondering if that was true, if history went on a different path, and China in the
Yep.
20th century actually, converged somewhat, that we would be speaking in Mandarin right now.
Yeah, we might. I mean, it would be a lot more appealing to speak in Mandarin if there were a super prosperous country, great hotels, business consulting opportunities that were 5, 10, 50 times more extreme than they are now, right? It'd just be a different world for all of us, both on the tourist side, on the consulting side, on the business management side. It'd be a very different world, right? I'm disappointed didn't get to see that world. So
All right, so I mean, obviously, you're talking about the deep roots of culture and how it's inherited through families, through ethnic groups, through populations. And I think a lot of the listeners who listen to me, they know about Albion Seed and the whole idea that there were even different Anglo cultures in the
yeah,
United States, and that has had an effect over the long term in American society. I mean, in 1850, the intellectual firepower of the United States was in this little region called New England, and today, maybe with the exception of Silicon Valley and Stanford, Berkeley axis, it's still in New England, right? And University of
yeah.
Chicago. Some of this stuff does last, but cultures do change. Cultural evolution does occur.
hmm
And so, like, I mean, how deep do you think these differences are? And like, what is the time scale of generations do you think that they can change? Because okay, 2 generations obviously wrong, or according to your review of the literature, it's wrong.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
about
that's
20
right.
generations? What about 200 generations? What about 2,000 generations?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that just when you look at these deep roots tests, it really is like 500 years seems to be the bliss point, right? That seems to be that when other researchers use data on state antiquity, going back thousands of years, or when your region of the world began settled agriculture, those have some predictive power, but they're nowhere near as good as the as technology. So I come up with little acronyms for those. So state history, how long your region has been under organized states, that's S. I abbreviate that S. How long your part of the world has had settled agriculture, I call that A. And then how much of the world's technology your ancestors were using in 1500, I call that T. So together, that's your nation's SAT score. But when you run the horse races, the statistical horse races, all the power's in the T. So year 1500, that's the real power. And so I don't want to claim that's the right number to the third significant digit. Maybe it's within 200 years of the right number or something. But we're not talking thousands of years. We're talking about when Columbus was sailing the ocean blue in 1492. That's like the time frame you want to think about. That set the stage. That was where the chess pieces were set for the modern world.
So it's weird. So basically, what you're saying is a study of the world in the year 1500
Uh-huh.
will make the world in the year more than 2000 now. That will really explain kind of the chess pieces, you say, or the furniture, the basic building
Yeah.
blocks.
As long as you adjust for migration, right? As long as you track people rather than places, right? If you keep track of who moved where since then you'll do a pretty good job. Not perfect, right? Nothing's ever perfect, but you'll predict more than half of cross-country income differences just by using those measures. And this is, it's really powerful to know that this simple statistical method. So even if somebody just rejects the causation stories that I'm portraying in the book that I'm reporting and analyzing myself, you should at least be aware of the correlation, right? And it's not just from violent European migration to the Western Hemisphere, although that's important, right? That's a thing that actually happened. It is of first order historical importance. I use the Chinese migration across Southeast Asia as a complementary piece of evidence for people who think, oh, yeah, that's just Western imperialism. That's all his book's about. So the relatively peaceful migrations of Chinese migrants across different countries in Southeast Asia had exactly the same statistical relationship, right? So peaceful migration, violent migration, either way, people matter more than places.
Yeah, I mean that's I mean you should put that on a t-shirt. People, not places.
Thanks. I mean, others have done this in the literature too, right? So I'm really
Yeah.
borrowing a phrase from, I'm borrowing phrases that were used earlier by Putterman and Weil of Brown, by Easterly of NYU. So,
Okay. Well,
yeah.
yeah, no, go on, Garrett.
No. I mean, it's a complement to the old. It's a contrast actually to the anthropologists' dichotomy of people versus pots, right? So the people versus pot story was this cultural change happening because people moved there or because the ideas sort of diffuse. In modern economics, a lot of the debate turned out to be for statistical reasons. A lot of our debate turned out to be, was it where people moved or was there just something magic about the land? You know, are geographic measures really, really powerful in doing most of the explanatory power? And when you run careful tests, it starts looking like, oh, it's people. And when you see evidence, when you do see occasional statistical evidence that makes it look like it's the places, you have to start asking yourself, you remind yourself, first, this isn't an experiment. Second, like the Europeans who were, horrifying in their brutality at conquest, they really have skill at this, right? They picked places that had the weather they wanted, right? So if you see a correlation between weather, distance from the equator, temperate climates, whatnot, and European migration, a lazy person might just say, well, it's just that the Europeans went to the good places. Those places would have been great no matter who was there. But one of the things that brutal conquerors do is they make sure they get the best real estate.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you can choose, you're going to choose the best real estate. This is as you were looking through this literature, I guess a question that I have for you is, what was the most surprising finding? That you had discovered, that you didn't have any expectation of before going in.
I'd say really is a chapter that's later in the book on diversity in the workplace. So I wanted to
wait. That's good though. Diversity in the workplace is good, right? It's our strength.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the norm, right? And organizations always say this, and I think that's it's that's more of a hope, more of a dream than an actual fact, right? And so I was really I looked at this literature trying to figure out because there's this cross-country literature that finds that there's some kind of countries with a lot of ethnic diversity are more likely to have ethnic conflict and civil wars and lower public goods provision. And it's a fairly, it's a useful literature. But, you never know if correlation's causation. The results are kind of a little muddled. It's a little hard to be sure of what you're seeing. The thing about businesses is that businesses have a strong incentive to play whatever hand they're dealt as well as possible, right? So if diversity really is a strength, businesses should be able to find a way to make it happen, right? Because they actually want to make the money. Also, when the scale of a study is smaller, you might be able to find something that's closer to a natural experiment. And so I started off telling the story of just a remarkable study done by a young economist, where he looks at how blossoming flowers are collected, gathered, and put into bouquets in Kenya. And it turns out that in this country, there are two dominant ethnic groups, and they're hired more or less randomly by this particular company that was studied. And he found that when you basically have two employees working together on a team who are of different ethnic groups, they do less. They're less productive. They just don't get along very well. There's long-standing ethnic conflict, and that shows up in dollars and cents terms. And what the author shows is that this is true even though the people are paid a piece rate. So the workers are paid a piece rate. They're not paid by the hour. They're paid by how much stuff they produce. And so even though there's actual skin in the game, money on the line, ethnic diversity in that place at that time is not a strength. So That's an interesting study because it's the closest you're ever going to get to a randomized experiment,
So
right?
what is the mechanism that's what do you was there speculation in the discussion? What the mechanism that was driving that?
Yeah, it's the it really is political differences, political anger, and the way he can test for that, at least that's an important factor, is that during the sample period there was a major disagreement over electoral outcomes. One side accusing the other of basically rigging the election, right? And that led to an outbreak of nationwide political violence. So one might have, if one compares that to January 6th, I wouldn't disagree. Um, and they found that during that period, productivity declined even more when the two workers were of different ethnic groups, right? And he can show that it's not that one ethnic group is better than the other at work, right? They're both equally productive. That's the nice thing about having all this data, right? Access to like unlimited data really helps. It's putting them together, especially during times when there's nationwide ethnic conflict, that hurt their productivity even more. So it's just something about like, you're not on my team. It's just harder to work with you.
Wait, is this an argument for partisan sorting in the workplace? So you'd have an insurance company, everyone's Republican, or something like that.
Oh, I think that is totally a reasonable area for exploration, right? If I were a young management researcher in the US, I would be trying to find ways to look for natural experiments that help me deliver that, right? Right? You could do
Well,
it. You know,
yeah.
I'm always thinking about whether military assignments could be used in this way, right?
Hmm.
Since the military moves people around sort of randomly in some ways, you can see if like if staffing ends up 90% plus Democrat or 90% plus Republican, how does that affect productivity? So yeah, this is well worth thinking about.
All right, so you have, I mean, this isn't an ideological book. It's not a polemical book. It's makes a case based on the literature and the research, but um, you kind of have an argument against open borders that you articulate. Can you just like talk about it in terms of, okay, so you have like to give thought experiment. You have all these people in South Sudan. I think it's the poorest country in the world. Like millions and millions of them, but they're not that many. We could just let's see. I'm gonna check the population right now on the fly. We got 11 million people in the South Sudan. Okay, there's
Yeah,
300. Yeah, right now 350 million Americans. If we moved the 11 million South Sudanese to the United States, their quality of
less than
life,
3%.
their quality of life, would go up a lot,
And they
right?
would and the vast majority of them would be gainfully employed in the private sector, genuinely doing great things, right?
I mean,
Like,
some of them would
that's
join the
I'm a big
NBA. Some of them would join the
I
NBA.
totally agree. This isn't some like I'm not going to use some right wing story about like people are just going to go on welfare. That's bullshit, right? People work, right? Migrants work. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, but why is that? Why is that bad? Why would bringing in 11? Because like it would be so good for them. This is a horrible country.
yeah, it would be awesome for them, right? And so, and it's possible, like if you're a good, effective altruist, you might say, well, that's going to be great for them, and if their arrival leads to racist backlash that hurts institutional quality, that's part of the diversity story. If a racist backlash like hurts American institutions, and even in a slight way, maybe that cost to the American institutional quality and the accompanying decline in American productivity is a sacrifice worth making to help 11 million South Sudanese have vastly better lives. And I'm open to saying, like, on normal effective altruist grounds, that sounds at least plausible. I mean, we'd have to sit there and do like a whole bunch of algebra to weigh things and make a bunch of judgments about how you make interpersonal comparisons. But like, A, I'm open to that being true as a strong default, and B, I actually don't know if my results are if these findings are true of population changes as small as 3%, right?
Okay,
Maybe
so
3% is the
so
equivalent of rounding error, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, everything I've assumed so far is linear, but do I really think that 3% is changing the culture of your country and changing the politics?
All right,
Maybe
so if
not.
we if we have 11 million people, and let's say we split them between 3 states, right? That would be
Yeah,
a
yeah,
significant effect probably. But if we have 11 million people and we distribute them relatively evenly across the
yeah,
country, it's 1 out of
yeah.
33 people, So, but okay, let's up the ante. Let's do 33 million. Let's do 10%. Okay, Nick, now how are you feeling?
Well, I mean, let me take a cheat here and jump to a broader question, right? Because all this stuff ends up just being a sort of utilitarian story about do the winners win more than the losers lose, right? And these utilitarian things ultimately just end up being judgment calls. And I thought about this for a long time, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to let that be a judgment call, right? Like I like relieving the unremitting suffering of the worst off people in the world. I think that's a really important thing to do. It should be morally welcomed, right? But here's what I realized as I thought about this. This is sort of my second surprise. This took kind of years of reflection to come to this point, I guess you'd say, which is that I eventually found out that the vast majority of the world's innovation, it's R&D, it's patenting, it's high quality scientific research, is happening in just 7 countries, right? And I call them the world's I7, the most innovative 7 countries in the world. So it's the US, 3 countries in Asia, 3 countries in Western Europe. And together, these 7 countries are clearly, by any measure, like just they're moving the technology frontier forward for the planet as a whole. They're doing more than half the work by multiple measures. So
Hey,
what my story,
I want to pause right there, and I'll let you continue. But I want to make this why this is significant. In
yeah,
in economic theory and in growth theory, technology is the driver of productivity growth. It causes positive externalities, spillover effects. So people who produce technologies like Eli Whitney's cotton gin, whatever you think of it, or the steam engine, they don't capture all the value for themselves. They capture some of the value, but then that value spreads out across the whole world, and it's a massive, massive non-zero sum game effect, right?
exactly.
So I
Yeah.
just continue why that's important.
Yes, yes. So basically, smartphones are invented in substantially in certain parts of California, designed and manufactured in a lot of Asia and Southeast and Southeast Asia, and yet people around the world are getting the benefits of these smartphones, right? The same is true with medical innovation. The same is true of like transportation, energy saving innovations. These things, all this innovation is overwhelmingly happening in just a few countries, although it helps people the world over, right? It may take decades for stuff to diffuse, but I'm old enough to remember when in the 90s, people worried about whether there would be a digital divide. That was the big Clinton era slogan. Would there be internet haves and internet have nots? And now it turns out basically 2/3 of the planet is every internet haves, probably more than that. So basically, technological innovations in a few places help people everywhere. Um, and so my story is that if migration weakens the institutional quality in these 7 sort of golden nations, even slightly, then that will probably hurt people all around the world for decades to come. So this is my story. If I wanted to talk, and so that I think this is a reason to be extremely skeptical about open borders type policies for those 7 incredibly innovative nations. If one really wants to have open borders where people can move from very low income countries to very high income countries, we should try to focus that on countries that have less population, less innovation. I often think of it half seriously as open borders for Iceland. Pick a country that's really productive, has good institutional quality, and let's encourage a lot of migration there. And if we lose the innovation that comes from Iceland or Denmark or Finland, that the world will have some cost, but it'll probably be swamped by the benefits to the migrants. If
Mhm.
migration hurts the institutional quality of North America, the entire world loses out. So this is no longer a story of migrants from poor countries versus longstanding American citizens. It's about migrants from poor countries versus the future poorest people in the world. So, and
Mhm.
that's a trade off that I think is much clearer because innovation really is concentrated in just a couple of countries. Most countries have essentially no patents per year, for instance, right?
Mhm.
So
Well,
there's just not a lot of innovation going on in most parts of the world that's
I mean, e
economically, socially important.
I mean, even in the United States, the innovation goes on in particular
Just a
pockets
couple
of
of
this.
places, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically if innovation and technology is what keeps our civilization going, it's being driven by very, very, very few loci of productivity. Very few.
Yeah, and it's extremely sensitive to institutional quality, to government quality. Basically, people who are doing this kind of, whether your research is patented or protected by trade secrets, um, this kind of research, very little of it happens in countries that are far from the institutional quality frontier. China's a big exception to that rule. It's one of the I-7. And you can see the reason they're able to do it is they're making up on volume, right? Per capita, China isn't all that innovative. But this is something, when it comes to innovation, we don't care about per capita. We care about the actual amount of raw innovation. And so, therefore, highly populous countries with high institutional quality are the places where you're going to look for a whole lot of technological progress that helps people the world over for decades to come. So, I think we should preserve and protect the I-7 and focus low skilled immigration policies on countries that are not part of the I-7.
So, I wanna kind of like tease apart like your model here a little bit. So let me tell you what I think. My perception, what a lot of economists have traditionally viewed, these sorts of migration dynamics and how they interact with economics. So you have this fixed set of you have institutions are fixed, they're fixed variable, fixed parameter, and you have these units of labor with certain amount of human capital variable by person that's moving from these administrative delimited by borders, and so they're just interchangeable and you can scale them up, you can scale them down. They're basically widgets in a vast macroeconomic machine. I feel like what that misses is that the widgets themselves are affecting the fixed parameter that you're talking about, the institution, and so
Yes.
there's a reciprocal effect. So is that the kind of thing you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it comes straight out of classic public choice, right? I mean, we have a lot of results in public choice and political economy that shows that voters really do change governments. Like who votes matters, right? And in a lot of cases, I'm like super excited about that, right? So, for instance, when women were given the right to vote, we have a wide academic research on this, especially from the U.S. and Europe. Women's suffrage, like, helped build the welfare state, right? It helped lead to more government funding for children's education, for childhood healthcare initiatives, like I think things that I think are genuinely good, and I'm glad I got more of that. So when we look at whether new voters mean new policies, NVNP, um, I think we routinely find that this is true. So we can't treat institutions as exogenous to the people who are showing up in the voting booth. I saw a nice paper here just here at George Mason a couple of weeks ago where a young scholar presented work showing that basically white Southerners moving to the West and to the Northwest basically changed the political outcomes in those areas. Basically, if you want to say at the very informal level, what the researcher was showing was that part of the reason where you're able to vote in Trumpy type policies in the West, the Northwest, parts of the North, is because white Southerners moved there, right? And it was a nice, like, politically correct version of these tests of whether new voters mean new policies. And again, this guy did it with multi generational work. He wasn't just looking at first generation migrants. So yeah, bunch of white people move from the South to the North. They're probably on average going to be bringing the kind of policies that their ancestors liked in the South into the North, at least on the margin.
Well, I mean, do you think one reason that the Persian Gulf monarchies work is because they don't have, so Qatar is a country where 10% of the people that live in the political, jurisdiction are citizens. And
Yeah.
they have an economic system where you have migrants come in, they produce and then they leave, but they never become citizens.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, Singapore does this to a lesser extent, right, with their very, very large guest worker program. Yeah, so this is something that uh, there is an empirical question, right? We don't have enough of these to run the real experiment, right? To what extent does the government have to respond to the people who are there, whether or not those folks have the right to vote? Is basically the power to riot, the power to protest in other ways, peacefully perhaps. To what extent does that control the government as well? Right? If there's something you know from the history of uh, Western Europe or from East Asia, it's that before the age of democracy, the threat of peasant riots really did act as a control on governments, right? So democracy isn't the only way to be a check on government. And I can't say that I have any quantitative estimate of the role of actual suffrage versus just being in the country as an influence on government outcomes. My hunch is the voting matters more. I mean, part of the reason I know voting matters at least at all is because women women's suffrage really did change political outcomes, policy outcomes in every country for which it's been studied. So it must count for something. But the question is that most of the story, or is it more like a cherry on top compared to mere presence in the country?
Well, so I mean, this book is reflecting the economic literature. Do you think people in political science, other sorts of international relations, will be interested in this, or do you think? I mean, look, I mean, I'm assuming your ambitions, like everybody reads this, but I'm just
Yeah,
curious about like how insulated these communities are and how open that
yeah.
they would be to this sort of thesis.
No, I think poli sci and sociology, or people in those fields really should find it interesting, and they'll say that like, oh, I'm talking about papers that a lot of them sort of heard on the margins, and what I'm doing is synthesizing things, right? So this question of migrant assimilation or non or persistence really is something that sociologists, anthropologists have really cared about. So, and economists have brought our tool, our battering ram of econometric methods and massive standardized surveys to address this question. And I have a hunch that it's going to be complemented by sociological, anthropological work that looks at multi-generational persistence of political attitudes. So,
Mm.
I hope that it ends up getting a wide scholarly audience, not just a wide popular audience, because I really am trying to synthesize 2, 3, 4 different strands of literature and point to a common thread that they have, and which is that cultural attitudes persist across generations, even if we're not sure of the channels why. And the whole world has a stake in the technological sophistication of these 7 incredibly innovative countries.
Yeah, innovation is good. Technology is good. I mean, that's just my opinion. Garrett. So your previous book, Hive Mind: How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own, and then you have 10% Less Democracy, which why you should trust elites a little more and the masses a little less. I do
Yeah,
like these titles. Not gonna lie. Um,
thanks.
what's your? Do you have a next project, or are you just enjoying being done with the book and just talking about it?
This book completes my Singapore trilogy. So Singapore plays an important role in all 3 of these books. Right? Singapore has extremely high test scores. That's Hive Mind. Singapore has a high degree of technocracy and a too low degree of democracy. That's 10% less democracy. And here, Singapore is this poster child for Chinese immigration, leading to just great institutional quality, as far as we can tell. So I'm just happy to settle down with this trilogy and let it sit there for a while and find exciting new projects to work on.
Nice, nice. Well, it was great talking to you. So everyone should check it out. Just to remind you guys of the title, The Culture Transplant: How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. There's a lot of great empirical illustrations in there. This literature seems fascinating. If you like history, this is going to be a great book too, because basically a lot of historical phenomena make cameo appearances, I would say, in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
book. So
I really enjoyed that. Yeah,
it's like familiar faces, so that's great. I will see you around, and I will talk to you soon, Garrett.
thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids